Hi everyone, this is Noah Sandler from Mtgo Academy, and today we're going to be continuing with my Eternal Masters limited review. So we've got blue cards today, and we're going to get things started with Arcanis the Omnipotent, 3 and 3 blue. It's a 3/4 legend. You can tap it to draw 3 cards, or pay 2 and 2 blue to return it to its owner's hand. So if you untap with this card, you're probably going to win the game. If your deck is reasonable, if you have enough win conditions, you're just going to be drawing so many cards that it's going to be hard for your opponent to beat you, unless if they're already really ahead on the board. And because it has the bounce ability, you can also block smaller creatures with it once you untap. And if your opponent has a pump spell, yeah, you could bounce Arcanis to protect it. But I think the bounce ability doesn't come up too often. Usually the cards that you draw, you just want to be casting them. You don't need to leave up mana for it. If you just draw 3 cards off of it and your opponent kills it, you're pretty happy. That said, unlike the other legends in this format of its cycle, it doesn't actually win you the game by itself. So you do need to have other win conditions where the cards like Sylvos, Visara, Rorix actually just finish the game. And it's possible to fall into a trap in this format of just having too much card draw. And that's a rare thing for limited formats, but there's just such good card draw in blue in this set. And especially like repeatable looting effects and ways to draw multiple cards every turn, that at a certain point there are some diminishing returns. And there could be the chance of actually decking yourself, but that won't typically come up, but it does reduce card draw value a little bit in this set once you already have some good card draw. But still, usually you untap with Arcanis and you'll win the game, so I'm going to give it a B+. Next card is Brainstorm. 1 blue instant, draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So this is one of the most discussed cards of all time as far as the strategy of how you play it. But first let's just get into the power level of the card for limited. You're paying 1 blue mana and you're going to draw 1 card. So it cycles for 1 mana, but you get to move things around a little bit so that you can set up your next couple turns, and so it's better than a 1-for-1 cycle, and that's pretty good. Pretty much any deck is going to be fine with playing that effect, so it's a card that you're rarely going to cut. It's usually going to be worth it, as long as you can get easy access to blue mana. You're pretty much going to play Brainstorm. Now the card gets a lot better if you have shuffle effects, because you can pitch your worst 2 cards, and it's a lot closer to just drawing 3 cards in that case. And in that case, it's really powerful. And there are some really good shuffle effects in this format. There's the Land Cyclers in blue and black, Civic Wayfinder in green. So there are definitely ways that you can abuse Brainstorm. But one thing about playing it is because you see 3 cards deep when you cast it, and then you're assuming you don't have a shuffle effect, you are stuck with those cards for a few turns. If you're looking for a particular answer, it's usually best to wait on the Brainstorm. Since it only costs 1 blue, it doesn't hurt too much to find a spot later on. So like turn 1 Brainstorm frequently isn't the best time to use it. Now, if your hand, if you need to make sure that you get your drops on time, maybe you can Brainstorm, you can find your 2-drop, cast it on turn 2, so then brainstorming turn 1 is fine. But if you're in no hurry, if you have other things to do, a lot of times you should just hold on to the Brainstorm, because every turn that you wait, you get to see an extra card deeper, and that means that if your bomb, the card that you need, is just 1 card deeper, if you Brainstorm it 1 turn too early, you won't be able to see that card for multiple more turns. So it is something that you want to hold on to if you can, but it's never bad to just cast it because you're cycling 1-for-1. So Brainstorm is very solid. If you have shuffle effects, it gets good. If you don't, it's just filler playable, So I'm going to give it a C. But if you have shuffle effects, it can definitely be better than that. Next card is Cephalid Sage. It's 3 and a blue, a 2/3 with Threshold. If you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, when it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards and then discard 2 cards. So this is a card that you need to have Threshold for it to be even marginally good. 2/3 for 4 is really bad by itself. So you need to consistently get Threshold. At any point, if you're casting this card and you don't have Threshold, you're very upset. So if your deck can really reliably get Threshold, its effect is actually very powerful. So draw 3 cards, discard 2. You're gonna look through a lot of your deck. Confine answers, and then throwing a body on the board means you're not going to fall too far behind in tempo compared to playing something like Deep Analysis, where maybe you'll fall behind in tempo. With a Sage, you're at least putting a body out there. So in a dedicated Threshold deck that has a lot of ways of getting to Threshold quickly, then this card is solid. But I don't think that that's going to happen too often. It's kind of a narrow application, and so I think this is a card that's almost always going to be at the end of the pack that it comes in. So I'm just going to give it a D+. Our next card is Control Magic. 2 and 2 blue, an aura, enchant creature, you control enchanted creature. So for 4 mana, you steal your opponent's best creature, and they either have to remove that creature, in which case you got a 2-for-1, or they remove Control Magic and you 1-for-1. So this card is really insane. Just 4 mana kill target creature would be a very good card. The fact that you kill a creature and you put an amazing creature into play under your control just for 4 mana is just insane. You would pay a lot more than 4 mana for that effect. Even 7 mana for that effect would be pretty reasonable. So at 4 mana, it's just really insane. There are some ways where your opponent can neutralize the effect somewhat. If they have a mana war, they can get their creature back. If they have some kind of disenchant effect, they 1-for-1 with the Control Magic. But if they don't, it's such a huge swing that makes it really hard to lose the game if you cast it. So I think it's one of the best cards in Eternal Masters, and I'm just going to give it an A+. Next up is Counterspell. 2 blue, instant, counter target spell. Now, a lot of us are used to Counterspell effects not being that great in Limited. And most of them cost about 3 mana, and they'll have some marginal added effect, or they'll cost 2 mana, but they'll be very specific on the type of cards that they can counter or require, or they only counter it if your opponent doesn't pay extra mana. So they're situational. And then for 4 mana, you'd get a counter with maybe a nice extra ability, but most of those don't end up being too good. And then 5 mana, you can get really powerful ability on top of that, but that's hard to set up. So I think there will definitely be people who will underrate the actual counterspell. It just gets past all of the negatives of other types of counterspells from being situational, because if you leave up 2 blue, you will be able to counter your opponent's spell. And leaving up 2 blue is not that punishing. Once you get up to 3 mana, it's hard to play a threat and leave up 3 mana. But when it's just 2 mana, your ability to actually play a good flyer and hold up counterspell, where you're not getting too punished if your opponent doesn't play something good, it's just so much easier to hold up 2 mana. And unlike cards like Negate or Essence Scatter or Move Soul, if your opponent plays a bomby threat, you will be able to counter it. Where with Negates, you hold up Negate and, oh no, they played a great creature. Well, okay, now you have to hold up mana again and maybe you've just lost. Or you hold up Essence Scatter, they play a non-creature and you can't counter it. And that's a really big flaw with those types of cards compared to the actual counterspell. Counterspell is good if you are behind. I mean, it may not be the perfect card if you're behind, because you want stuff that's going to get you back on the board. But again, just 2 mana to be left up means you can stop your opponent from putting you even further behind. You can cast something that can block and leave up Counterspell to stay safe. And if you're ahead, it's just about the most powerful thing that you can have. And the way to play it if you're ahead is basically only counter the cards that are going to take you from being ahead to being behind. It's not just that you want to counter like cards that are good, cards that remove a good creature from you, or like your opponent plays a big creature and you're like, okay, I'll counterspell it. You want to let yourself fall, like you want your lead to get slightly smaller, slightly smaller, slightly smaller, but you have counterspell. You'd rather do that than use the counterspell and maintain a big lead. But then if your opponent has a sweeper, suddenly your opponent's now leading the game. So that's typically the way you want to actually play Counterspell when you're ahead, is only counter the things that you really need to counter. If you still have the lead and a Counterspell in your hand, you're in a better situation than trying to get a bigger lead. So if you play it that way, that's what makes the card so good. Like it does take skill to get the most out of Counterspell. But if you're going to play it that way, it's a very strong card, and maybe the best blue common in this set, and I'm going to give it a B. Next card is Daze. 1 and a blue, instant. You may return an island you control to owner's hand rather than paying its mana cost, and you counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. So Daze is one of those situational counter spells. It's not going to be able to counter every spell that your opponent plays, because people play things off curve frequently, and it's a pretty bad draw late in the game. Once your opponent gets up to 6 or 7 lands, usually they're going to have extra mana up when they cast their spells. It's not a guarantee. Sometimes they'll cast 2 things in a turn, and you'll take what you can get at that point in the game. But where Daze really shines is kind of in the early to mid game, somewhere around turn 5 or 6, where you can tap out for a threat. And then if your opponent taps out to play something really threatening, you can Daze it. And what's interesting is that actually comes up pretty frequently, because just by definition, your opponent using up all their mana on one turn to cast one spell is probably going to be a really good spell for that turn, and therefore will be a good card to Daze. So Daze ends up hitting a lot of really powerful cards. The stuff that you really want to counter, typically your opponent is going to be tapping out for. Unlike Counterspell, Daze, you might need to use it early to avoid having it stuck in your hand for the rest of the game. But it's just such a big tempo boost if you can cast something. And the fact that you just don't have to leave up mana for it means you get an even bigger tempo boost from casting cards and then being able to Daze something. So that makes it a really nice card. You're going to be happy to play it in any blue deck, and I'm going to give it a C+. Next card is Deep Analysis. 3 and a blue, sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards, and you can flash it back for 1, a blue, and paying 3 life. This is up there with Counterspell as the best blue common, in my opinion. So you have to look at this card in different ways to kind of get the feel for it. It's very flexible, so it actually plays well in a lot of different circumstances. So 1 is you pay 6 mana and 3 life, and you get to draw 4 cards. That's very close to the card Opportunity, which is amazing. Basically 6 mana, draw 4 cards. And Opportunity is instant speed, so Opportunity is better for that exact effect. But Deep Analysis can be broken up on 2 turns. So on turn 4 you play Deep Analysis, and then on turn 5 or later, whenever you have 2 mana available, you can flash it back for 2 and 3 life. And 3 life is not that big of a deal. Sometimes it can come up, and if you're playing multiple Deep Analyses, then you may have to stop flashing it back, maybe after the first. But this card draws you so many cards for just a common card. that as long as you're not too far behind on board when you cast your first one, you're usually going to have time to flash it back, and then you're up 3 cards on the deal. You've used Deep Analysis, and you've drawn 4 cards, so 4 minus 1 is 3, and that's just a big advantage on your opponent. So if you haven't died after you flash it back, your board state is reasonable, then you're probably going to win that game. And even if you're a bit behind, because you now have had some nice card selection, you'll have the answers you need to take the game back. And then you throw on top of that this card can be played out of the graveyard. It's got flashbacks, so it's great for Burning Vengeance. And if you self-mill and you hit Deep Analysis, you get 2 free cards out of it, which is amazing. So very strong common card. I'm going to give it a B. Next up is Diminishing Returns, 2 and 2 blue, sorcery. Each player shuffles his or her hand and graveyard into his or her library. You exile the top 10 cards of your library. Then each player draws up to 7 cards. So, this card is an even effect. You're going down 1 card to cast it. You have to put it in your deck, and you're paying 4 mana. And then both players get an even effect. Now, it's not actually going to be even because you're going to have different number of cards in your hand. If you have a lot of cards in your hand and your opponent has few, then you're just not going to cast Diminishing Returns. So you want to set up a situation where you have few cards in your hand, preferably 0, and your opponent has a lot, and so Diminishing Returns will give you a profit on the number of cards that you draw from it. So you're going to draw 7 cards, and your opponent, shuffling their hand back, may only draw 2 cards. So that's like the best case scenario, is you draw a bunch of new cards, and they shuffle back some cards and maybe draw a few cards. So what kind of decks can take advantage of that? Decks that are going to empty their hands quickly. So you want to have as few cards in your hand as possible. So that means you want to be an aggro deck with a lot of cheap cards. You don't want to have too much card draw with it, because if you're getting a big hand size, spending your turns drawing cards, then Diminishing Returns isn't really going to help you out too much. The one place I think it could have a role is in like a red-blue burn deck. So you burn your opponent down, play some early creatures, Called Marauders type stuff, and you get your opponent low. And then you've just run out of burn, and then your last card is Diminishing Returns. Once your opponent stabilizes, now you draw 7 new cards. Now you can just start burning them out again, and hopefully finish the game that way. But it's such a random card, and good players would want to reduce the amount of variance in their games. So having both players draw 7 random cards in the middle of the game, maybe your opponent just draws good cards, you draw lands. It adds a lot of randomness to your games. So it's not a card that I'm going to want to play that often. And especially the negative effect from it is that you spent 4 mana on your turn, so you're less likely to be able to take advantage of the cards that you drew immediately. Then your opponent untaps, and they have all the mana that they have to cast 8 cards, because they're going to draw 1 card in their turn. So they basically get to throw stuff out before you, and that makes it just naturally better for your opponent. So you really have to take advantage of it to make it good. I don't think that's going to happen too often, so I'm giving the card a D-. Next card, Dream Twist. 1 blue, instant, target player puts the top 3 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, and it flashes back for 1 and a blue. So in a random blue deck, you're not going to want to play this. It's card disadvantage, and milling your opponent, unless if you actually beat them that way, it doesn't do anything. So this is a card that is strictly a combo card. Like, you need to be taking advantage of this card to make it worth losing the 1 card that it takes to play it. So where can you do that? If you're playing a Threshold deck, after you flash this back, this puts a total of 5 cards in your graveyard, puts 6 cards in your graveyard. So because you have to flash back the twist, it doesn't put the full 7. Like, you put 3 in, but you remove 1. after you play the twist. So it puts 6 total cards in your graveyard. That's really close to Threshold. So if you're a really focused Threshold deck, it's probably a card that you want to play. Giving all your creatures like +2/+2 or +3/+3 is worth going down a card. And that's like a major, like a double or triple Anthem, and that would be worth a card. So it can be reasonable there. I think its best use is in the blue-red Burning Vengeance deck, because you get a shock out of it if you flash it back, and it can find other flashback cards, casting it and flashing it back. Kind of gets your engine going, so I think it's quite good there. One place I wouldn't play it is in a blue-black Reanimator deck, which isn't a very consistent theme in this draft format. So you would not want to play a card just to try to enable your reanimation effects. For that deck, you more just want to play looting effects and like land cyclers. So I don't think Twist is going to play a role there. So it's a very specific use card. But in the Burning Vengeance deck, I think it's going to be pretty good. So overall, I'm going to give it a D+. Not something that you have to pick highly. Most other people aren't going to be interested in it. Next card, a real skill tester, Fact or Fiction. 3 and a blue, instant. Reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put 1 pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. So this is one of the better card draw spells that they've made. It's hard to evaluate exactly how much you can expect to draw off of it, but if the cards you reveal are relatively average, you'll draw about 2 decent cards compared to the other pile, the 3, more cards, but not quite as good. It really depends on which cards you flip, but if you think of it as just drawing 2 cards for 4 mana instant, that's not very good, but because you're seeing 5 total cards, and if you flip something like a Control Magic or a Jace the Mind Sculptor, you can guarantee that you take that card. That means it actually filters quite well. On top of that, this is a great format for graveyard strategies. And Fact or Fiction, while it doesn't actually put 6 cards into your graveyard, some of them it'll put in your hand, which is good enough. So it's going to put a lot of cards into your graveyard. So if you flip flashback cards, whether it goes into your hand or goes into the graveyard, you're going to get the value from that flashback effect. So Fact or Fiction is actually better than it typically is in this format, and it's already a very good card. So I'm going to give Fact or Fiction an A-. Next card is Force of Will. 3 and 2 blue, instant. You may pay 1 life and exile a blue card from your hand rather than pay its mana cost, and counter target spell. So first of all, you're probably just taking Force of Will for the money. There are definitely cards in this set that you're probably going to want to rare draft, but assuming that you're at a pro tour, it's still important to. I don't know if there's a Eternal Masters Pro Tour, but it's still worth for evaluation purposes to evaluate these cards in limited, regardless of their actual dollar cost. So Force of Will is actually a very playable card. For 5 mana to counter something is awful. You would never play a card that just did that, but sometimes you're going to be ahead in the game, and all you have to do is just leave at 5 mana, you counter your opponent's comeback mechanism, and then you win the game. So it can be good there. But really it's about the safety net that this card provides you. So if your opponent plays something incredible that you have to stop, you can Force of Will it. If you're playing a half blue deck, which is going to be pretty common, you're going to have enough blue cards to remove to use it pretty consistently. So you're usually going to have the option. While no one wants to have to lose 2 cards to counter a spell, the fact that you can keep just playing your game, keep casting spells, and then if something really bad happens, you get to Force of Will it. It's really nice to have that option. You don't just use it on a removal spell on a solid creature that you have. You want to use it on your opponent's Wrath of God or their Visara. Something that's really going to put them ahead in the game. But if you do that, it's actually really nice to have. So I'm going to give it a B-. And our next card is Future Sight. 2 and 3 blue, enchantment, play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library. So this card can draw a lot of cards for you. If there's a land on top of your deck, you can play the land, and then immediately the next card that comes off, if it's not a land, you can cast that, and then the next card comes off. So you can draw 2 to 3 extra cards per turn using Future Sight, and it gets out of hand pretty quickly. And since you're getting lands off of it, that means that you're going to have more mana in play, which means you can cast the spells off of it more easily, and it's a really good engine. The problem with it, it does cost triple blue, so you've got to be very committed to blue to make it work. But if you were a mono blue deck, for example, the card would be very, very good in the B+ range because it's so committing, and there is a lot of card draw already in blue. I think it gets a little bit weaker, so I'm just going to give it a B-. Also because revealing these cards to your opponent, it does mean that every single card you draw, your opponent knows that you have it, and while you have so many cards in your hand that it might not matter, they can use that information against you, and I think that is worth docking the card, about a half letter grade for that. Next card is Gaseous Form. 2 and a blue, aura, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by enchanted creature. So it turns the creature into like a wall that can block freely and not die, but it doesn't actually deal damage. So in a normal game of Magic with normal decks, you wouldn't really want to play this card because you're not getting a 1-for-1 with it. You're giving your opponent, if you cast it on their creature, like a great blocker for the rest of the game. So you might have to use another removal spell on that creature later on. So to make this card good, because it is even 1 more mana above pacifism, and for a card that's typically just going to be the same under best case scenario, and under most cases going to be a lot weaker, you really need to take advantage of it. Like, you have to have a very specific deck to make this card good. So if you're running like a 5-color Honden deck without many creatures, you're just winning with Hondens, that could work. A Burning Vengeance deck, you're trying to finish your opponent off with Flame Jab and Oona's Grace. So any deck that's not trying to win, especially not with ground creatures, then this could be a reasonable card there. Also, it's good for sideboard if you're the flying deck and you face a deck that has a lot of ground creatures. And I mean, your creatures fly, so giving your opponent a really good ground blocker doesn't actually matter for you. So I think the card is decent there as well. But in general, it's going to be a pretty bad card. So I'm going to give it a D-. Up next is Giant Tortoise. 1 and a blue, a 1/1, and it gets +0/+3 as long as it's untapped. So, blue creatures that can block well are typically better than they would be for their stats if they were in other colors, because you've got flying creatures. So you need to have some way to hold the ground as you attack with your flying creatures, because flying creatures tend to have worse stats than non-flying creatures. So if you're playing a fair game, your opponent's creatures are going to tend to be bigger or come out faster than your creatures. So the way to equalize that is to play some creatures with high toughness that can block well, and so it slows your opponent down just enough that you can beat them with your flyers. So a card like Giant Tortoise, which is basically like a 1/4 blocker for 2, is actually pretty solid. So if you're playing the flyer deck, I think it's a reasonable main deck card, because most decks are going to have some number of ground creatures that Tortoise can hold off. And it actually plays very well against the red-white tokens deck. Decks that have 1 toughness ground creatures, then Tortoise might actually hold off multiple creatures in a turn. So you'd be getting like a virtual card advantage. It'd be sort of like a 2-for-1 in that case. And a lot of times your opponent's going to have to use a removal spell on it. So the other use is if you're playing like a slow Honden deck, some kind of control deck, and you have a lot of removal spells, but you don't want to have to use removal spells and your opponent's 2-1 or 2-2 early in the game. Tortoise can basically blank that card, and then you're free to use your removal on bigger threats later on. So it's actually a pretty important role player in this format, and I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have a very similar card, Glacial Wall. It's 2 and a blue for an 0/7 defender. So Glacial Wall is going to play a pretty similar role to Giant Tortoise in the flying deck, basically in the same kind of decks that Tortoise would be good in, the same kind of matchups. So the difference is that Wall can block really large creatures. So like a 5/5, 4/4 or bigger, Tortoise is not going to be able to stop it, where the Wall can hold it off 1 for 1. Where Tortoise is better is that it costs 1 less, so if you want to play some flyers from turn 3 on, you're going to want to play Tortoise on turn 2. It's going to work a lot better for your curve. So having to play just Defender on turn 3 means that you're going to be slower to the punch and actually beating your opponent. And then the other way that Tortoise is better is that it does deal 1 damage. And so if your opponent's playing a lot of small creatures, including stuff with 1 toughness, then Tortoise is just going to be better, because it could actually hold off multiple creatures, where Wall is only going to hold off 1 creature. Tortoise also could attack for 1 damage every once in a while, but that's not too relevant in evaluating these 2 cards. I feel like Tortoise is actually going to get... is probably going to be a little bit better on average, but it depends on the matchup which one's going to be better. So I'm going to give Glacial Wall a D+. Next card is Honden of Seeing Winds, 4 and a blue, legendary enchantment shrine. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card for each shrine you control. So I think this is clearly the best of the shrines. I think by far the best on its own, because drawing 2 cards a turn is just amazing, and is definitely worth just paying 1 investment of 5 mana. I do think it might be one of the weaker shrines once you start getting a lot of them out, because there is a real chance of decking yourself. Typically with the other shrines, once you have 2 to 3 in play, you're just going to win the game. Like, your opponent can't beat you, and you're going to have enough card advantage. Like, if it's the black one, they're not going to have a hand. With the green, you're going to have plenty of blockers and eventually beat them with 1/1s. The red could burn them out. The white means you're just not going to die. But if you have the blue one out, you might run into the threat of decking yourself, where normally you just want to slow things down once you get a bunch of Hondens out. So as far as like matching multiple Hondens up, it's not the best in that case, but it's the best on its own. And it's still obviously very, very good if you just get blue Honden and 1 other Honden out. So I'm not to really knock the card, but it's just worth noting that this is a better like on its own card in general compared to the other Hondens. But this is just a really high pick in any blue deck, and in the Honden deck is also going to be a key piece. Helps you draw into your other Hondens. So I like it better than Future Sight. It's also easier to cast, splashable. So I'm going to give it a B. Next card is Hydroblast. It's 1 blue instant. Choose 1. Counter target spell if it's red, or destroy target permanent if it's red. So worth noting, you can target a spell, you can target a permanent that's not red. If you just want to get this out of your hand for some reason, if you had a young Pyromancer and you just need to play a spell, you are able to do that. But it's a really good sideboard card against any red deck. Either countering a spell or destroying a permanent is going to be what you're going to want to do for just 1 mana. It's so cheap. So if you're playing against a red deck, it's very powerful. But since it has to be in your sideboard, you're only going to play it in 2 out of the 3 games, potentially. Even if your opponent is red, and then if your opponent isn't red, it's just going to sit in your sideboard the whole match. So that's worth considering when you're thinking about like which cards to actually draft, compared to cards that you're going to be playing with a lot more often. Though on the other hand, if you're comparing it to some card that's filler that, you know, at the end of the draft may or may not make the cut, you know, it would only be a slight improvement over the card that you end up playing or end up leaving your board. Hydroblast at least means that you're going to have a very powerful card in some matchups. And so it's usually best to lean on having cards that potentially could be really powerful over cards that are just filler level. So I would be taking Hydroblast over anything that is filler. So above anything that's not something that you're happy to put into your deck. So I'm going to give Hydroblast a C+, because it will be one of the best cards in your deck if you are facing a red deck. Next card is Inkwell Leviathan, 7 and 2 blue. It's a 7/11 artifact creature with Island Walk, Trample, and Shroud. So this card is just about unbeatable. You need an Edict effect or you know, some kind of board sweeper like Wrath of God to remove it. You can counterspell it when they cast it, but if your opponent gets to 9 mana, they cast this card. Unless if you're winning the game next turn, you're probably going to lose. Now, 9 mana is very hard to get to. 8 mana is very hard, and 9 mana is a lot harder. So you need to have like a lot of card draw, ramp. You need something. You can't just put this in any blue deck and hope to ever cast it. So I think this is a card that you're going to leave in your board a lot if you do draft it. If you're in a really grindy matchup, it is a great finisher. So if the game's going to go really long and you're going to get a ton of lands out, then it might even be the best card in your deck in that situation. Worth noting, it has Shroud, but you can target it with Animate Dead, and it's the best creature in the format to get with Animate Dead. So if you're Reanimator and you've got reanimation spells and looting, this is a really broken card that you can get out. So I would absolutely first pick it in that situation. But I think it's kind of rare to end up in a good blue-black Reanimator deck and have the option of taking Leviathan, so they won't come up too often. But it is very, very powerful, and you know, worth noting that and bringing in for certain matchups. But I tend to avoid playing 9 mana cards because you just don't get to 9 mana a lot. People are playing fast decks. It just gets stuck in your hand. So overall, I'm going to give it a C+. And our next card, Jace the Mind Sculptor, 2 and 2 blue. You'll have to read this one on your own. Hopefully you know what it does by now. So much text on it, 4 abilities. The card is incredible and limited. You play it on turn 4 or any time in the game. It can protect itself by bouncing something or by Fate Sealing to get it up to 5 loyalty. And then you usually brainstorm with it most of the time, just drawing 3 cards. So, I mean, you get up 1 card every turn. So that plays similarly to the blue Honden. And yeah, sometimes you could ultimate it, but usually you just finish the game before then. So this is an insanely powerful card, one of the most powerful cards that they've ever printed, and it's going to get a pretty easy A+, and probably the best card in this set. And the next card is Jetting Glasskite, 4 and 2 blue. It's a 4/4 flyer. Whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability for the first time each turn, counter that spell or ability. So it's quite a good finisher. Your opponent has to use, you know, typically 2 removal spells to get rid of it. Sometimes they'll have some other targeting mechanism, like something on a creature they have, like a Prodigal Sorcerer, and then they'll just use 1 removal spell on it. But it just takes a lot of resources for your opponent to kill it. And it deals 4 damage a turn, is hard to block well, so it can finish games. Its stats aren't great. 6 mana for a 4/4 flyer. You'd want to spend 5 for that. But at a certain point, it doesn't really matter. Once you have control of the game, if you're drawing a lot of cards, which blue does a lot in this format, it will get the job done. And I think one issue with blue is that it's so good at drawing a bunch of cards, taking control of the game, but it is lacking a little bit in actual win conditions, and jetting Glasskite fulfills that role really well. So it's actually a pretty high pick, and just a good finisher, so I'm going to give it a B. It's also a great card to reanimate. So next card is Mana War. 2 and a blue, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature to its owner's hand. So this is just an amazing tempo creature. For just 3 mana, you get the bounce, plus you get to put another creature in play. It's just so cheap for that effect. So sometimes you can, play card draw and play Mana War in the same turn. So you end up further ahead on the board. You get to press whatever advantage you already had, like attacking with your flyers that turn. Then your opponent, plays something, in their next turn, but they're already so far behind. It goes great with the really good counters in this format. So on turn 5, you can go Mana War on your big threat, and then have the counterspell up to remove it. And there's also flicker effects and Gravedigger to be able to reuse Mana War. Can make it really, really broken. So another card that's up there for best blue common. I would expect it to probably be the best blue common. The more controlling your deck is, the card does become a little bit weaker. But if you're a tempo-based deck, the card is definitely the best common for blue. So I'm going to give it a B. And the next card is another great tempo spell. It's Memory Lapse. 1 and a blue, instant. Counter target spell. If that spell is countered this way, put it on top of its owner's library instead of into that player's graveyard. So it's very similar to the card Remand, in that you get to temporarily counter spell, and you don't go down on card advantage. So the card replaces itself. It denies your opponent's next draw. So if you have the advantage on the board, you're beating your opponent down, and they need to play a spell to survive. If you memory lapse it, the game's over, because they're not going to draw their next card. It's like if you're ahead on board, it becomes really good. It can act like a time walk, because you get to attack with all your creatures, and then you basically force your opponent to play their turn over again, except you're still getting more damage. If you're behind, it's definitely worse, but still you can cast something and memory lapse something, stops you from falling too far behind, and so it's actually fine at any stage of the game. And it's nothing amazing, but it's just very solid and something that you're happy to play in any blue deck. So I'm going to give it a C+. Coming up next is Merfolk Looter. 1 and a blue, 1/1, tap, draw a card, then discard a card. So this card has always been great. Has always been a high pick in every limited format that it's been in. Costing only 2 mana is really cheap for this effect that can very well win you the game. Now, you are basically down a card by casting it, because a 1/1 isn't worth a card. This is a card that your opponent's going to have to kill on sight. The filtering every single turn just makes you find the right answer to your opponent's threats and find your threats faster. So it's already a really good card. But in this format, there's a lot of good graveyard synergy. So for Reanimator deck, the Burning Vengeance deck, any flashback cards, even just your average blue deck is going to have some way to take advantage of having extra cards in your graveyard. So it's even better here, and I'm going to give it an A-. Next card is Mystical Tutor. It's 1 blue, instant. Search your library for an instant or sorcery card, reveal that card, shuffle your library, and put it on top. So I think tutors are typically overrated in limited formats, because when you cast them, it puts you down a card, and you're turn behind as far as initiative. So if you consider casting Mystical Tutor for a Divination, Divination is a card that's very solid in any limited format. But if you Mystical Tutor for one, it actually becomes bad. Because you have spent a card, you spent 2 cards, and you've drawn 2 cards. So you haven't done anything, and you actually spent 4 mana over 2 turns to do nothing. So if you consider how bad that makes the card Divination, you should be pretty skeptical about having Tutors being a good card in your deck. So where they are good, there's two things. One is if you have a really, really powerful bomb that you're going to search for, then that can make a Tutor worth it. Even if you're down a card, the card that you're going to get is so powerful that it's still going to be worth it for you. And then the other thing, I think you still need to have really powerful cards, but it gives you flexibility. So if you have a variety of different answers, so you have Counterspell, if you have like Factor Fiction, so like whatever you need for that situation, you can find it with the Tutor. The flexibility might make it worth missing out on the card and having to wait an extra turn to play it. Because remember, you're playing the Tutor over another card that could have been in your deck. So you have to compare it against just casting some other card to playing your Tutor, waiting a turn, being down a card, and then playing your next card. But I think with Enlightened Tutor, there are some really insane enchantments in this format that are totally worth spending a turn to put them on top and losing a card. For instance, in sorceries, there's not as many, but there are a few. I think mostly Wrath of God, Balance, Toxic Deluge. You're looking for cards that are going to make back their cost of tempo and losing a card, and those are cards that can actually do it. So if you have those cards, Mystical Tutor does become a good card for your deck, but only when you have those cards plus the flexibility of also having like a Counterspell does it actually become a strong card itself. So I'm just going to give it a D+. Next up is Oona's Grace, 2 and a blue, instant. Target player draws a card and has Retrace, so you can cast it from your graveyard by discarding a land card, and you can do that as many times as you want for each land and each 3 mana. So if you play this in your average deck, it's kind of like looting for 3 mana. And when you compare that to Merfolk Looter, where you just pay 2 mana once and you get to loot every turn for the rest of the game, Oona's Grace, you have to pay 3 mana every single time. It's definitely not a great rate what you're getting. So this isn't a card that I like too much in your average deck. If you don't have mana sinks, you could maybe just play 1 Oona's Grace. So in case if you end up with too many lands, Oona's Grace can even things out and help you draw spells. So it can be okay. If you're in a grinding matchup, it could give you the advantage you need in a long game. So it could be okay there too. I think its main use is going to be in the Burning Vengeance deck, where every time you retrace it, you get to shock something. And that's quite an engine. So you're going to draw an extra card every turn by paying 3 mana and shocking something. And you can maybe do it multiple times per turn if you have 2 lands. So it's actually a pretty key card for that archetype. But they're going to go really late, so you don't actually have to spend a high pick on it. So I'm just going to give it a D+. Next card is Peregrine Drake, 4 and a blue, 2/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, untap up to 5 lands. So it's a card that you're basically not going to be able to cast before turn 5, but when you do, you get a free 2/3 flyer. And a 2/3 flyer is definitely worth a card. So getting one for free is a nice deal. And it's really good for tempo, because you get to play a 2/3 flyer, and then you can leave mana up to either cast another threat, to play some expensive card draw, or even maybe play something else small and leave it mana for a counter. I imagine Peregrine Drake into Mana War, leave up Counterspell would be a huge tempo swing. So the card can be very nice if you have the other cards in your hand to take advantage of that extra mana. And so yeah, it's an all-around solid card. If you have Warden of Evos Isle, you can actually profit a mana if you have 5 lands in play. So that's pretty cool. And it gets bonuses from any Flyers Matters cards. So yeah, overall, pretty nice card, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Phantom Monster, 3 and a blue, 3/3 flyer. So simple card. It's really good for its cost. 3/3 flyer is big enough to be a finisher, and it's a powerful card on curve. It gets all the advantages of other Flying Matters cards, and it's actually not a bad blocker either. So it's a card that's basically good in any blue deck. It's splashable, and even if you're not very aggressive, because it blocks pretty well, it can block other smaller flyers, and then it's big enough to finish a game. So it just makes it a very solid card, and I'm going to give it a B-. Next card is Phyrexian Ingester, 6 and a blue. It's a 3/3 with imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile target non-token creature, and it gets +X+Y, where X is the power of the exiled creature, and Y is the toughness of the exiled creature. So it's basically 7 mana. You get to kill your opponent's best creature, and you get a big creature. So that's a really nice deal. And because you get to kill your opponent's best creature, usually your opponent's best creature is going to have a lot of stats. So that means that Ingester is probably going to get pretty big. So you could take an average case sample that you kill a 3/3. So you're going to get a 6/6 and kill your opponent's best creature for 7 mana. And it exiles, so that's kind of nice. And it's only 1 blue mana, so it's completely splashable. Blue does... for like blue control decks, which is a great archetype, you definitely could run out of finishers, and this is one of the best ones, and it's great to reanimate also. So even though it's 7 mana, it's really, really powerful, and I think it makes it still just a high pick for what a swingy card it is. So I'm going to give it a B+. Next card is Prodigal Sorcerer, 2 and a blue. It's a 1/1, tap it to deal damage to a creature or player. So this card has always been a strong limited card. It can give you card advantage. It does depend on the matchup, but this is a format where there are a lot of 1 toughness creatures, so it's pretty reasonable to actually kill multiple things with it, and then it starts dealing damage to your opponent's face, so it can finish off games slowly, or it helps you trade up, so your 2/2 hits their 3/3, the sorcerer can finish off their 3/3. It's something that your opponents are usually just going to kill on sight, and you should probably do the same if you're facing one. But it's just particularly good in this format, and goes great against the red-white token decks. So I'm going to give it a B+. Now we have Quiet Speculation, 1 and a blue, sorcery. Search target player's library for up to 3 cards with flashback, and put them into that player's graveyard. Then the player shuffles his or her library. So you're going to use it on yourself. You want to have more than 3 cards with flashback to put this card in your deck. It's worth noting that flashback costs are usually not very good compared to the actual cost to cast a card. So this isn't quite like just drawing 3 cards, even if you are able to get 3 flashback cards, because you're going to be paying the overcosted flashback effect for each one. So that makes this card kind of slow. You'd be excited to get 2 Firebolts and a Silent Departure with the card, but then you still got to pay 15 mana to get 4 damage and bounce a creature, plus the 2, so that'd be 17 mana total. So the card's pretty slow. It definitely has value if you have Burning Vengeance, because Burning Vengeance plus Speculation means you've basically got the engine going, and you can get at least 3 shocks out of it, and probably more, considering you'll get stuff like Deep Analysis, Dream Twist, to keep the engine going. So it's good there, but you probably want at least 5 flashback cards that are worth getting, because you might have already drawn some. So if you just have 3, sometimes you'll have already drawn 2 of them by the time you draw Quiet Speculation, and then you can only get 1 card with it, and that's pretty awful. So not a very card overall, pretty much just there for the Burning Vengeance deck. It shouldn't be that hard to pick one up. But for that deck, I'll give it a C-. And elsewhere, an F. Next card is Screeching Skaab, 1 and a blue. It's a 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. So, it helps fuel graveyard-based decks. If you hit something with flashback, that's pretty nice. If you hit something, a big creature to reanimate, that's pretty good too. It gets you closer to Threshold as well. That said, it only gets you 2 cards. There's just 2 random cards, and it's just a 2/1 body for 2. And so it's never really overperforming at anything. You have to get lucky, even in a deck with a lot of graveyard matters cards. Just 2 random cards, you're going to hit lands pretty frequently, random spells that don't have flashback. I mean, your chances of actually hitting really well with it are not that high. And then the 2/1 body for 2 is pretty weak for blue. It doesn't block too well. I mean, if you trade with it with something early and then you get 2 cards out, then that's fine. But I think even in the decks that want this type of effect, I feel like the card is actually kind of weak. So I'm just going to give it a D+. Next card is Serendib Efreet. 2 and a blue, 3/4 flying. At the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to you. So the stats are amazing for the cost. 3/4 flying would normally cost about 5 mana, and you get it for 3. So if you're being aggressive, that's amazing, because you won't care about the damage that you take too much, and it just helps you curve out with a lethal flying team a lot faster. So great there. And then, the more controlling you are, it does start to get a little weaker because taking 1 damage every turn does put a clock on you. But it still blocks so well that it can hold off your opponent's team for just 1 damage a turn. So it can actually still buy you time. The only place where it's bad is if your opponent has passivism effect, and then they get the 1/1, but then they also have an enchantment in play that says you take a damage every turn, and that can definitely lose you a game. So I feel like I'm going to take a half letter grade off for that, and just give it a B. But it's a very solid card, and something I'm reasonably happy to first pick. Next up is Shoreline Ranger, 5 and a blue, 3/4 flying, and it island cycles for 2, so you can pay 2, discard it to search your library for an island, and put that into your hand. So I think this card is better than it looks. Being able to island cycle a big creature is a very powerful ability, because usually if you're putting a 6-drop into your deck, the main cost of it is that you won't be able to cast it. It's just too slow, because if you don't have the enough mana for it, it just sits there as a dead card. But with land cyclers, you land cycle them in that situation. And if you're flooded, then paying 6 mana for a 3/4 flyer is actually not a bad thing. A 3/4 flyer, as I was saying with the Efreet, would probably be worth about 5 mana. So this is overcosted for that, but being overcosted is not that big of a deal if you're able to turn yourself into a land. It's also, just puts itself in the graveyard, so you can use Animate Dead on it on turn 3 to get a 2/4 flyer, which is a pretty good play. It's a lot of value for a card that can also be a finisher for the end game. They tend to go pretty late, but it's a card that I rarely cut from my blue decks, so I'm going to give it a C. Next we have Silent Departure. It's 1 blue, sorcery, return target creature to its owner's hand, and it flashbacks for 4 and a blue. So this is a very powerful limited card. It was great in Innistrad. As 1 blue to cast it for the first time is actually reasonable. Not exciting, but it can be a good tempo play. You play it. You play a creature and then you play Departure on the same turn. But being able to flash it back as well. So you could pay 6 mana, bounce 2 things in 1 turn. But the typical way to use it well is you cast a creature, bounce their creature. Next turn they replay their guy, and you can just flashback Departure, bounce it again, and meanwhile attacking for damage. So if you're ahead on board and you're attacking for damage, then Silent Departure is just about the best card you could have. And if you're behind, you can still use it to play a card to block and bounce their biggest threat, and it slows down your opponent a bit, and then eventually you could take advantage of the flashback cost. So it's really good in aggressive decks that are tempo based, and it's not as good in control decks. that are trying to grind out. It's nice you get 2 uses out of it, but those decks more want to neutralize threats rather than just bounce them. So sometimes it'll be cuttable. Maybe like the second one would be cuttable in more of a controlling deck, but it's still a very powerful card and really good in aggressive decks. So I'm going to give it a B-. Next we have Sprite Noble, 1 and 2 blue, 2/2 flyer. Other creatures you control with flying get +0/+1. You can tap it to give other creatures you control with flying +1/+0 until end turn. So it's a Windrake, 2/2 flyer for 3, which is fine by itself, and then it has 2 other abilities that are pretty relevant. The +0/+1 is really nice for your 1 toughness flyers like Squadron Hawk. Protects them from ping effects, and sometimes if you have 3 other flying creatures, you'd rather just use the Noble's +1/+0 ability because you're getting more damage in that way. But it also helps you trade up your 2/2 flyer for a 3/3 flyer, and that's just a lot of extra abilities to have on what would already be a good creature for the cost. So in the blue-white flying deck, it becomes very good. And I think overall, I'm just going to give it a B-. You don't need that many other flying creatures to make it worthwhile, but it's going to be a really high pick for the Flying Matters deck. Next is Stupefying Touch, 1 and a blue aura. When it enters the battlefield, draw a card, and enchanted creatures' activated abilities can't be activated. So, worst case scenario, it's 2 mana to cycle, so that's not that bad. And sometimes removing a creature's activated abilities basically neutralizes the creature entirely, like a Prodigal Sorcerer. If you can get it on a Mother of Runes, if you're on the play and they play it on turn 1, that's amazing. But sometimes they have something like Visara that you want to stop, but then they still get a 5/5 flyer. So you're happy to have done that, but you still got to remove the creature. So it's very matchup dependent. It's a card you can definitely just throw in any deck. If you're short on playables, it's totally fine because it replaces itself, and you might randomly find a use for it. But it's also something that I think I would typically cut because there's only so many good activated ability creatures in this format. But that does make it a pretty good sideboard card. If you see a few of them that your opponent has, if you can neutralize a creature, you can just about get a 2-for-1 with it. So that can make the card pretty good, but overall I'm going to give it a D+. Next up is Tidal Wave, 2 and a blue, instant. Put a 5/5 blue wall creature token with Defender on the battlefield, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So this card, you're trying to kill your opponent's ground creature that is like a 5/5 or smaller. And it's not even necessarily going to kill their creature. They do have a chance to respond. But that effect is okay if you know that your opponent's just attacking with like medium-sized ground creatures. Like 3 mana to kill target small attacking creature isn't that great. Your opponent's never playing around it because the card's pretty bad. But it doesn't hit flying creatures, so it's just not a very powerful card. If your opponent's playing like a green deck with medium-sized creatures and you need some more ways to interact, then I think it's a reasonable sideboard card. But I think it's just kind of weak for this set in general, so I'm going to give it a D-. Next card is Warden of Evos Isle, 2 and a blue. It's a 2/2 flying. Creature spells with flying you cast cost 1 less to cast. So this is like the Lord of the Flying deck. Making them cheaper is actually really good in blue, compared to, say, if this were an elf card that made your elves cheaper. Because if you can cast your flyers cheaply and then leave up extra mana, that means you can leave up counters. So that's a very powerful effect. And it starts on a Windrake, 2/2 flyer for 3, so it's already decent. And then being able to get your flyers out more quickly, or cast your flyers and leave up extra mana to do other things with them, that's really, really good. And it has some nice synergies with Squadron Hawk, being able to just, for every white mana, just pump out a 1/1 flyer, or Peregrine Drake. Allows you to actually profit mana off the deal if you have at least 5 in play. It just makes this a really strong card for that archetype. So I'm going to give it a B-. And our last blue card is Wonder. 3 and a blue, 2/2 flying. As long as it's in your graveyard and you control an island, creatures you control have flying. So as a 2/2 flyer for 4, that's a bit overcosted, but it's definitely a card. It's something that your opponent will have to kill at some point, and it blocks reasonably well. So it's not that bad for the cost. But if it's in your graveyard, giving all creatures you control flying is potentially a very powerful ability. Flying creatures tend to cost maybe 1 full extra mana over non-flying creatures, so you're adding a lot of value to your creatures if they don't fly originally. So it's very deck dependent on how good that ability is going to be. Most decks you have will at least have some non-flying creatures, but considering there is the blue-white flying creatures deck, that deck isn't actually going to be that interested in Wonder and might cut it from the deck because you're going to be running mostly flying creatures, so giving your giant tortoises flying isn't going to be that useful, and you are overpaying for the card to begin with, so it can be cut from those decks. But if you're playing a blue-green threshold deck and you've got like 4/4s and 5/5s, and you can drop a Wonder into the yard, then it becomes really powerful. And it's really easy to get into the graveyard. If you have looting effects, mill effects, it can find its way in there. But also, if you just put it out there, you can just threaten to block any creature your opponent attacks with, and then it hits the graveyard, and all your creatures have flying. Or you can just attack with it every turn, and at some point they will have to deal with it. It's 2 damage can make a decent clock by itself. So it usually finds its way into the graveyard at some point, if there's no passivism or exile effect. So yeah, it makes it a pretty strong card, and I'm going to give it a B. So that does it for blue. I think if you pay attention to the grades in general for this color, you'll notice that it is actually a very good color in this format. I think it is probably the best color. It just has a lot of great commons, and I mean, of course, uncommons, rares, mythics. I mean, just a lot of cards in the B range. So it's very deep. I think maybe the downside to it is that for red blue, like you want to look at the color combinations, how cleanly it pairs with other colors. Like red blue and blue green are both kind of gimmick decks, so I think that weakens the color a little bit in that you kind of have to draft a specific deck if you're going to pair those colors together. Where I think white tends to just combine with other colors a little more smoothly. I think the blue-green threshold deck or the blue-red deck both could end up with just like a horrific draft, so they're a little riskier. But overall, it's just a very powerful color. It pairs really well with white for the blue-white flying deck, which could be one of the best decks in the format. And blue-black control, maybe with the Reanimator theme, is also very powerful. Plus, if you can get the Burning Vengeance deck or Threshold deck, that can be really good too. So that's it for today. Join me again for the next part of this review as I review black cards. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.